about it. Anyway, what's happening elsewhere on the battlefronts? Well, there was some contradictory talk about the situation around Bakhmut yesterday. I say contradictory talk, not very much from Ukraine, quite a lot from the Russians, but we have two completely different versions of events. Well, not perhaps completely different versions. One was from Redovka. They suggested that the Russians are now on the attack west of Bakhmut. They say that the Russians have made attempts to advance in the area of Grigorievka, which is a town somewhat to the north of Bakhmut, where Ukraine had launched an offensive, part of its offensive some weeks ago, that the Russians are busy trying to recapture ground there, and that the Russians have also attacked in the direction of Ivanivska, though so far without success. Boris Rozhin, the commentator who writes as Colonel Kassad, has had a slightly different story. He says that Bakhmut is completely secure. There is no possibility of a Ukrainian attack on Bakhmut at any point in time, but the Ukrainians are still trying to make advances on the flanks, though without any success, though he does say that there are still some troops, Ukraine still has some troops in reserve in the area that it could deploy to the area. He also speculates that the Russians might go on the attack in this area at some point, but he also says that the weather conditions have again deteriorated. There is once more lots of rain, and that makes movement of men and machines difficult, and therefore the offensive actions by either side have ground to a stop. Well, as I said, they're not exactly, to put it mildly, the same reports. And of course, as I repeat again, I am not on site. I don't know exactly what is going on around Bakhmut. But I suspect that there's an element of truth to both accounts. I think that the Ukrainians perhaps have made the odd counterattack in one or two places. I suspect that the Russians have also launched probing attacks, especially towards Ivanivska. I doubt that either side is making any serious effort to advance in and around Bakhmut. The Russians, after all, are going to carry out a rotation of troops soon. The Wagner forces are going to be pulled back to the rear to rest and re-equip and have their forces reinforced with new fighters. We'll come to that in a moment. And the Ukrainians, for their part, are drawing back and trying to consolidate following the disastrous loss of Bakhmut. So I suspect that this is true. And of course, the rain no doubt does make things rather more complicated. So that's the situation around Bakhmut. We've also had some other statements from Denis Pushilin, who is the acting head of the Donetsk regional government and who, by the way, recently visited Bakhmut. He has said that it will retain the future name of in the future its old Soviet name of Artyomovsk. He's also said that the settlement of New York, there is such a place, which is close to Donetsk, once it's captured, its name also will revert to its Russian name. It will no longer be called New York. And he talks about the eventual reconstruction of Bakhmut and such things. But he's also spoken about the situation in other parts of the battlefronts. He said this in a live broadcast today on Solovyov Live television channel. He said, I have no special concern over Avdiivka and Marinka as guys with combat experience from the 1st Army Corps are positioned there. The situation is under control. In Marinka, we do not yet see any active operations to push them out. That's to say, to push the Ukrainians out. Whereas in Avdiivka, we see actually daily improvement of positions. In other words, the Russians are standing still In Marinka, they're not making any attempt to push back, to push the Ukrainians out of what part of Marinka is left, but they are still continuing to advance in the Avdiivka area. He says the enemy made attempts to counterattack in the Marinka area, but these attacks were all neutralized. And I suspect that's true. But anyway, that's the only other information we're getting about events on the battlefronts. And what about other things? Well, we've now had some more statements about Prigozhin, about the fighting in Bakhmut. First thing I'd say, and I think it's in some ways the most important, is that he has again repeated that the Battle of Bakhmut was not intended originally to result in the capture of the place. It was intended to ground the Ukrainian army down. The capture of Bakhmut has turned out, in a sense, to be, from a Russian point of view, an unexpected bonus. It was not the original plan, but it was the way, if you like, things turned out. And we've had I think, rather good discussion of that element of this battle from General Douglas Macgregor. Now, he's done lots of programs about this, but he's also done an interesting article for the American Conservative. I would say that there's been some comments about Douglas Macgregor. People have pointed out that, like Scott Ritter, he made predictions of a rapid Russian victory at the start of the war, which were not fulfilled, and people have criticized his military understanding of the war in consequence. In my opinion, General Macgregor's, and by the way, Scott Ritter's military assessments tend to be largely accurate. What people perhaps are overlooking is that neither man could have understood the political constraints that operated on Russian decision-making at the start of the war, which explains why the Russians, in the first few months of the war, basically pulled their punches. They weren't seeking at that time an outright victory, the kind of outright victory that Ritter and Macgregor thought they were. They were seeking instead a negotiated settlement of the conflict, which they came very close to achieving in the talks that took place in Istanbul at the end of March 2022. I just want to say that because I have nonetheless, despite those earlier predictions, found both Scott Ritter and Macgregor to be extremely sound commentators about the military side of the war, something which, of course, I don't have the grasp, the expertise, the background in military matters to share this kind of feel for what goes on the battlefields that military professionals like Scott Ritter, Douglas Macgregor, Brian Beletic, Daniel Davis, people like that all have. Anyway, this is what Macgregor says, and I'm going to quote him here. I'm going to quote this article because I think it captures this very well. He says, until fighting begins, national military strategy developed in peacetime thinking about warfare in its objectives. Thinking about warfare, shapes thinking about warfare and its objectives. Then fighting creates a new logic of its own. Strategy is adjusted, objectives change. The battle for Bakhmut illustrates this point very well. And he then discusses General Surovikin. He says, when General Surovikin assumed command of the Russian military in Ukraine last year, President Putin and his senior military advisors concluded that their original assumptions about the war were wrong. Washington had proved incurably hostile to Moscow's offers to negotiate, and the ground force Moscow had committed to compel Kiev to negotiate had proved too small. Surovikin was given wide latitude to streamline command relationships and reorganize the theatre. Most importantly, Surovikin was also given the freedom of action to implement a defensive strategy that maximized the use of standoff, attack or strike systems, whilst Russian ground forces expanded in size and striking power. The Bakhmut meat grinder was the result. And Bakhmut meat grinder, Operation Bakhmut meat grinder, is, we now know, the name that was actually given to this operation by Surovikin. Prigozhin has told us this. And then McGregor goes on to say, when it became clear that Ukraine's President Zelensky and his government regarded Bakhmut as a symbol of Ukrainian resistance to Russian military power, Surovikin turned Bakhmut into the graveyard of Ukrainian military power. From the fall of 2022 onwards, Surovikin exploited Zelensky's obsession with Bakhmut to engage in a bloody tug of war for control of the city. As a result, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers died in Bakhmut and many more were wounded. And I think that is exactly how it turned out. As I said, I don't think the original plan was to capture Bakhmut at all, but that is how it also turned out once the grinding of Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut proved even more successful than